And now we have a session addressing the extent of human mobility and immobility in a changing climate. And to lead this session is AGS President Marie Price.
Thank you, John, and I'm so happy to be here and talk about the topic of human mobility, which has engaged much of my research over the last 20 years. There are some eye-popping estimates concerning human mobility in a changing climate. The IPCC figure that 1.2 billion people could be displaced by 2050 has received a lot of attention because of its sheer size. And to put it in perspective, the UN estimates that in the world today, there are about 300 million people living outside their country of birth, so this number would be 4 times larger. But what does that number really mean? And would that level of mobility lead to cooperation or conflict? Human mobility is a long-practiced strategy for dealing with climate and climate change. Pastoralists who move their herds, people that live in northern climates moving to warmer places in the winter, farmers who flee drought. The key consideration is both scale and duration of mobility. A displaced person could move 3 miles or 3,000 miles. We do know that internal displacement is often driven by disasters, which can be climate-related, fires, floods, droughts, and extreme heat. Internal movements are far more likely than international movements. The duration of mobility, do people stay away for days, months, years, is also critical. So yes, 1 billion people could be displaced, but for how long? Think of how many people temporarily move each year in the US in response to hurricanes. To consider mobility and immobility and what it will look like in a changing climate, I'm joined by 3 thought leaders. Alex de Sherbinin, the director of the Columbia University CSUN, and one of the newest counselors of the American Geographical Society. He will share some of the models that they've developed at CSUN to consider questions of habitability and instances of climate change and greater immobility. Sarah Rosengaertner, from the Global Center for Climate Mobility, and has recently returned from the COP meeting in Baku, will share survey results that her organization have conducted on how people think about mobility, understanding adaptation strategies, and provide some examples from cases in the Caribbean and Africa. Finally, Lawrence Huang from the Migration Policy Institute will consider policy options which focus less on the idea of climate refugees and more on protection systems that could provide regular or alternative paths to mobility. I've asked each panelist to speak for 10 minutes. Please listen carefully and take notes and write down questions, because I am determined that we're going to get several questions from the audience this panel. It's going to happen. So with that, I turn the mic over to Alex, and I look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Marie. Great, looks like it's up. So I told Marie in advance that I was going to touch the 3rd rail of geography, which is environmental determinism. Yay. So really happy to be here, and this is probably my 4th or 5th Geography 2050, so I always enjoy the mix of the audience and the presentations. So this is an article that I wrote with some colleagues at the Climate School and also a geographer out at Oregon State, David Rathel, who's one of the lead authors on the IPCC Working Group 2 assessment in the last cycle, which basically looked at, he was responsible for migration. And we, started with the kind of question of what do these top-down biophysical models tell us that are essentially driven by climate, essentially GCMs, and then go through process-based models, et cetera, about future habitability, and how can we balance that with a better assessment from sort of ground-up understandings, what's going on in local realities. So we base our definition of habitability as environmental conditions that support a healthy human life, productive livelihoods, and sustainable intergenerational development. And later, sort of as an afterthought, I realized, well, it has to be at a reasonable cost, right? Because we could put people on Mars, but that's going to be extremely expensive, and we already put people on the South Pole, and that's also extremely expensive. Habitability, in our definition, comprises 3 dimensions. It's physical and psychological safety, livelihood resilience, so the ability to actually grow or make something or survive from food security, essentially, and then collective ability to respond to risk, which is really a function of governance. And we believe that climate change will undermine these through 3 dimensions. The 3 dimensions will be undermined through including basic human survival. So, you could say that places are becoming uninhabitable if they can't survive in that area, if there's livelihood security risks, or if the state simply can't manage the risks that are occurring in that location. And it's engendered a fair amount of discussion, and I've been asked to speak on this in a few different locations, including at the national academies. And I started thinking about this question of habitability more deeply since we published that paper, and thinking about, well, what has geography said about this in the past, and what can we learn from those earlier discussions? So George Perkins Marsh, raise your hand if you recognize that name. Okay, early geographer and environmentalist, and actually came out of my alma mater at Dartmouth College, went on to be ambassador. He would probably be a welcome guest at this kind of event if he were alive today. And he wrote this sort of pioneering book, Man and Nature. And if you look at some of the quotes, he's talking about the Mediterranean basin and how lush and verdant it was during the Roman Empire and how barren and desolate it is today. And so you can also look back at Malthus and sort of say, he didn't get it right. So, what gives us great hope that we're going to get it right tomorrow about the ability of society to adapt to some of these changes? So some of the problems I think most of us in the room are aware about this environmental determinism and the idea of habitability is that it likens human populations to other species in terms of thinking about their ecological niches. What's the ideal temperature and precipitation range for humans? Has these echoes of environmental determinism of the early 20th century, ignores climate immobility, who gets to define habitability, and what is its policy utility at the end of the day if we say that a place is becoming less habitable? I'm not saying we should discard it entirely, but I think we have to interrogate it. That's my point. So here's a recent article that basically critiques this idea about the human climate niche. Here's some of the modeling efforts that are out there, or efforts to kind of describe. I think the one on the left is just an early climate hotspots modeling effort where they took a bunch of parameters and said which areas across these different parameters, heat, precipitation, et cetera, are going to become more or less stressed by climate in the future. So the bigger the circle, the more likely there's going to be bigger impacts. The one on the right side is basically where they kind of looked at the temperature niche and precip and some other things, and then they kind of looked at demographic growth, and they said between demographic growth and climate change, places are likely to get more or less habitable. The one on the bottom is the one that's actually attracted a lot of backlash recently. It was published in PNAS, some of you may have seen it, and it's basically temperature-based and said there's just going to be parts of the world that are going to be way too hot for people to live in. So, and the one on the top is just an illustration or a map that we used in our paper for science. So given these past critiques of carrying capacity and concerns over environmental determinism, are there new approaches that acknowledge human agency and the potential for locally and globally creative solutions while recognizing that we live in a world of finite resources with limited ability to absorb the vast amounts of greenhouse gases that are generated by a consumer society? And I put up, I like this paper. It's by Mike Hume, another geographer, has been very prominent in the IPCC, and you can read the text for yourself, but he's a big critic of these approaches. I'm a co-author of a forthcoming paper, hopefully I think it's going to be in Nature Climate Change, where they're critiquing this idea as well and kind of addressing some very specific concerns about what talking about habitability means for local in situ adaptation, and also maybe what you might call climate redlining. If you call certain places uninhabitable or likely to be uninhabitable in the future, are development agencies going to be investing in those regions, or are they going to simply pull out because they say there's too much risk? This is an example of one, we talked about Tuvalu earlier. This is Carol Farbotko, who's in Australia, another geographer, who basically was part of an online seminar or cyber seminar we organized through the Population Environment Research Network. And she said that this narrative of inevitable uninhabitability is being resisted through a number of things in different areas, and this is also in Tuvalu. So it kind of it coincides with the same topic that was covered earlier and some of the same themes. We did work with Brian Jones, a geographer and demographer at CUNY Institute for Demographic Research, on a model of projecting future climate mobility for the World Bank. Some of you have seen those results. Then that was sort of retrofitted. I will just say we enhanced the model for efforts in Africa with the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. Sarah Rosengaertner is representing the group that sponsored that, GCCM. And we kind of used some different inputs and different climate variables, and we can talk more about the details in discussion if you want. And then more recently, we did a new release on the Caribbean, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But basically, a lot of these approaches are predicated on the notion that habitability is actually a construct that can be somehow measured or possibly approximated. We did not go down the line of there are hard thresholds beyond which people will no longer be able to live in certain areas for any of these efforts, but they suggest that some places are going to be more favorable and other areas are going to be less favorable, and there may be migration from less favorable to more favorable areas. Or maybe it's not more favorable, but they'll just be less significantly impacted by climate impacts. This is a short description of the modeling approach we took in both Groundswell and the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, where we essentially use grid cells of population. We project population forward under two scenarios, one with climate impacts and one without climate impacts. It's all calibrated based on past sensitivity. So we have like past population change and past climate impacts, and so we could calibrate it and then carry that over and kind of project into the future. All things being equal, if society is similarly sensitive in the future as they were in the past, how might populations shift? And then you can subtract future population scenarios from each other, one with, again, and one without climate impacts, and you can get some sort of out of that derived migration. And so the red, in this case for Senegal, the red areas are areas where we projected in the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative that there would be movement into those areas as a result of climate pressures. And the blue areas are places where there would be migration out of those areas due to climate pressures. But this is also kind of, it's a counterfactual. It's basically saying, there will still be migration and there'll be population growth in all these areas because in Africa, a lot of countries are growing very rapidly, but there will be potentially more growth in some of these areas in the red areas, owing to climate impacts. Then you can sum up all the red grid cells and basically come up with a total migration over the time period, sort of cumulative migration up to 2050, happens to coincide with Geography 2050. And the numbers in Senegal at kind of a high end under business as usuals, and also under even a low growth emissions, but also high population growth scenario, are in the range of about 1.25 million cumulative migrants over the course up until 2050. We did the same for all the developing world under Groundswell, and again, the models differed slightly in the way that we set them up, but basically you might have seen the number in the media of 216 million potential climate migrants by 2050, but they very rarely state that there's also a low-end estimate of 48 million. And so that's the low end of the lowest scenario. You can see in the green bar on the top. And so I find that that's sort of one of the things that we grapple with in our work is that nobody really wants to hear about what the lowest possible one will be. It's always about the highest. And then you can do interesting things to tell different stories about like urbanization and about pastoralism and things like that. In the Caribbean work, we're looking at a different model entirely, which is what's called a computable general equilibrium model coming out of economics. It's basically about differential wage rates, and wage rates are impacted by all these climate hazards in different locations, and people will tend to move if wages are higher in the destination area than they are in the area that you live in. And then there's some cost to migration, which is a fraction of your overall wealth or income. So it's all about economics, and it has a different sort of logic behind it. One of the nice things about this model is that we can actually project separately local, meaning within country, migration within admin one or small units within a country, national migration across admin one unit, so from one province or state to another, and then international migration. And these are just some kind of maps that you can get from this website if you go to the Greater Caribbean website. And this shows the GDP impact, so that's fundamental to the model. It really is important. And then you can see that a lot of lowland areas and maybe more heat-impacted areas are more likely to have higher losses of GDP. And then out of that, you can get the net mobility, and this is a map of that. And then finally, you can sum up, just like we did for groundswell and for the ACMI work, the number of climate migrants. But the difference here is his model, this is a guy named Mikhail Brzezinski. He's at the Luxembourg Institute for Socioeconomic Research. So we work very closely with him on designing the model and figuring out how to actually fit it for purpose for the Caribbean region. You can actually get immobility numbers out of this. And what you can see is that at the national level and the local level, immobility actually balances out mobility. And so you actually are getting kind of a net zero, maybe at most, like for the whole region, a net of about 1 million migrants who are mobile over the numbers that are immobile. And then at the international level, you can see that there's actually more outmigration than immobility. So let's just finish with 2 slides, and one of them is basically saying, yeah, that's all great. You can project these things. It's deterministic in some ways, and maybe that's not so great. But how do we face the fact that there are really messy local realities? So one project that we have funded by DoD Minerva is basically looking at, we're going to be looking with data that we have on border apprehensions at the US southern border at 2 countries, Guatemala and Honduras. And one of our hypotheses, and it's actually borne out by some interviews that have been done by a group called the International Refugee Assistance Project, is that most migrants are not leaving because of climate per se. They're not going to the border and saying, I'm coming because I'm a climate migrant, or I'm a refugee from Guatemala and Honduras, and please receive me. But if you actually interview them and get deeper into their stories, what you find out is that major hurricanes like Ida and Iota that occurred a few years ago, other major disasters, heat stress and drought, these are things that do displace people internally. And when they get displaced, they may find themselves in debt. They may be finding themselves more prone to be extorted by local violent groups, gangs mainly, and narco-traffickers. And so there's this kind of sense in which the displacement and the dislocation that occurs because of climate factors then feeds into some really negative things that happen in their lives that may then result in them leaving. It's a sort of, the violence in the region is such, and the kind of extortion of local smallholder and other poor people is such that they simply decide to leave. In Burkina Faso, some other evidence, and both of these are not published yet, they're in prep. I'm sharing a figure that I probably shouldn't be sharing, but it was so fascinating to me that this, one of our colleagues, Kira Vink from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and some other German affiliate groups sent it to me just for comments and I said, this is really also emblematic of what goes on. And so the Pul herders, if you've heard of them, or the Fulani, in West Africa have been herding for generations, generally peaceable, but as climate stressors are increasing, what's happening is these herders are losing, in a sense, what's the most important to their identity, which is their livestock. They're also increasingly maligned and viewed as negative actors as Islamic extremism increases in the region. And so you probably can't see all the little diagrams and arrows. Geographers love these, don't they? But basically, this identity crisis and this sense of being maligned by the state is driving them in some ways either into a displaced situation on the bottom or into a jihadist sort of situation where they're easy recruits by jihadist organizations, which sort of fulfills, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and so they're caught between a rock and a hard place. State actors, the military, are increasingly targeting this ethnic group above all other ethnic groups. So there's also messy global realities that have been touched on in the last panel. Basically, if you look at cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, they're basically the inverse of the passport index, which is the ability for people to move around freely in the world. So you can see Africa and much of the Middle East, which are going to be heavily impacted by climate change in the future. Essentially, their passports are worth nothing when it comes to traversing international boundaries. So with that, I'll stop and pass the mic to whoever's next.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, and thanks for inviting me. This is actually a great segue to my presentation. As Alex mentioned, we've been working together on some of these modeling projections, but we're not a research organization. The Global Center for Climate Mobility, we work with researchers, we work with modelers, but our mission is really to strengthen the agency, both of countries, governments, but also communities that are facing climate risks and that have to make decisions about moving or not, when, where, how. We bring together different partners working in Africa, the Greater Caribbean region, and the Pacific. And I will share some of our research findings from Africa and the Greater Caribbean with that notion of how people who are in those situations, how are they perceiving the risks that they're facing, and how is it influencing their thinking about mobility. Some of them have already moved, others are considering moving. So I want to shed a bit of light on that kind of thinking and what we have learned by doing survey work with partners from, on the one hand, Samuel Hall and the Mixed Migration Center. So we always combine this kind of local perspective with the top-down modeling that Alex presented, and we try to bring that together in a analysis of the realities facing some of these pretty vulnerable regions. So those are the two reports we have produced so far, the African Shifts Report and the Great Caribbean Shifts Report, which we're just about to launch. And I want to talk about the research, both surveys and focus group discussion research that has informed these reports, starting with climate experiences and to what extent people are seeing climate impacts in their lives. And this is from the Greater Caribbean. We interviewed people in 6 countries, 14 communities across those 6 countries. And what you can see here is that there's a fairly high percentage of people across all those countries, across those communities, that are seeing impacts of climate change in their lives. The percentage was pretty pronounced in Colombia, and this should be Colombia, not Colombia, where, interestingly, the response group includes quite a high number of migrants who had come from Venezuela to Colombia. So we did the research in Barranquilla and in Santa Lucia, Barranquilla being a city that has received a number of migrants in recent years, Santa Lucia being further inland and very flood-prone area, both of those locations. What are the impacts, what kinds of experiences have people reported? The most commonly reported are droughts, floods, and cyclones in this region. And we see that there's variety across countries, with non-surprisingly the small islands reporting higher levels of cyclone impacts, and you have strong flooding impacts, as I mentioned, in Colombia, but also in some of the countries facing those heavy storms. We see, and this is from the Africa research, but appeared in the Greater Caribbean as well, that there are some differences in perceptions by gender. So we found that women are generally more likely to report that they have seen negative impacts from climate change in their lives. And this is interesting because when we look at the climate literacy levels, and this was research done by our colleague Nick Simpson in Africa based on Afrobarometer data, the women actually less likely to know about climate change. So if people are asked, do you know what climate change, the concept means, what are the mechanisms behind it, women were less likely to be able to explain that. But at the same time, they are more likely to report some of the negative impacts that are already visible in their lives. And we see that dynamic to a lesser extent, but also in the Greater Caribbean. So there's always a slight discrepancy between people witnessing things that are happening around them and them being able to connect that to kind of the concept of climate change and the larger global forces that are driving these impacts. What are some of the repercussions that people report from having those climate impacts in their lives? Interestingly, at least I thought this was not surprising, but is not, I think, so far as prominent in the literature and in the research. Emotional well-being, negative impacts on emotional well-being and high stress levels were the most reported impact in the Greater Caribbean region. And this was driven particularly by the island populations in small islands that have gone through hurricane and then rebuilding and then another hurricane. Health impacts also really highly reported, linked to mosquito-borne diseases, increase in mosquito-borne diseases, but also respiratory issues. So I think this was a really interesting finding to us. And it's also a contrast with some of the findings in Africa, just in terms of how are people looking at the prospects for the future? Because what we found in Africa, and this is based on research in the countries that you see here, Nigeria, Angola, Egypt, Uganda, Malawi, Mozambique, where, again, we did targeted research in specific communities. People were asked, people reported already having climate impacts in their lives, but when we asked them about prospects for the future, there was actually quite a lot of optimism. People were still hopeful that the future will be better for them and their families, despite seeing these negative impacts in their lives. How does this impact aspirations to move? And this is a key message. People want to stay home. The majority of people want to stay home. This is true in the Greater Caribbean. So the yellow here is people who said no desire and no plans to move. And this is true for Africa as well. You see, interestingly, that Colombia has a slightly higher share of people that are saying they're considering but are unable to move. And again, there might be an interesting link with the fact that these are people that, to a large extent, had moved in recent years already and now find themselves probably with less resources to be able to move again, but with the aspiration to potentially move again because they're less rooted in this place. This is looking at the correlation between age and the wanting to move, having a preference to move. And we see a very strong trend across all the research locations for older people to say, I don't want to go anywhere, I'm staying here. And this was also quite pronounced for the communities that are more rural-based, where the livelihoods are more tied to nature and agriculture. In Africa, similar picture. So you have more than half saying we're not considering moving, and then you have about a quarter that said we're considering it, but we don't have the resources to move. So even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to. And in that group, you usually find more women than men. This is by age group, and again, this is a consistent finding across both regions. You have the 18 to 24-year-olds for the Greater Caribbean, similar pattern, being still overall not eager to move, but to a higher extent ready to move than their older peers. So the younger ones and the more educated they are more ready to say, I want to move, I'm planning to move even. And here there's, again, the gender breakdown, and you see that women, to a higher extent than men, said we're not considering moving, or we would consider it, but we don't have the resources. In the Greater Caribbean, the modeling projections actually interestingly suggest that women will be both overrepresented among those who move and among those who will stay. So they're more sensitive to the climate signal in either direction, you could say. And this is dovetails with Alex's point. Is climate change the main factor in people's decisions to move? It usually is not. So the share of people that say, yes, it's the main reason is quite small across the different locations. But it is, if you take all the blues together, it's not an insignificant factor either in most of the locations. So when people were asked, in the future, would you move or would you consider moving? Climate comes in, but it comes in among other factors. And this is from the Africa research, looking at how important are livelihood and economic factors versus climate factors. And you see that the climate factors are really strong, where you had sudden impacts, Beira, Mozambique being hit by a cyclone, and people just had to move, right? So there you have 86% saying, yes, climate is the factor for me to move. But in a lot of locations where the impacts are less acute, the economic factors will, play an equal role or, outweigh the climate motivations. I think what we can take away from the field research, in my mind, are first, people really insist on their right to stay, and there is a risk perception. People are aware that bad things are happening, and yet a lot of them feel quite attached to their homes. People use mobility as a mechanism to protect their homes, so you find a lot of temporary movement actually being used as a means to support those who are staying behind. But then the prospect of permanent relocation is kind of a different level. Yeah, so people perceive in the qualitative conversations, like the fact that they have to move permanently is really experienced as a very disruptive experience. And I think what that implies for policy, and our colleague will speak more to this, is that really, the policy response needs to be multi-pronged. Like, it needs to invest in people's right to stay. It needs to enable mobility as a means of supporting adaptation, but we also do need legal frameworks to protect those who will have to move permanently. And where there's currently very little guidance, governments all over the place are starting to relocate people and communities, and yet most of them do that without having explicit legal frameworks and policies in place. And so there's a big gap there when it comes to the development of norms and policies. Thank you very much.
that was a lovely little segue because I think my first slide will talk about a multi-pronged approach. Hi, everybody. I'm Lawrence. I'm a policy analyst at MPI. I am not a geographer. I am not a modeler. I am an imposter here, but hopefully a useful one. My job is to support primarily high-income destination countries to develop policies that respond to the impacts of climate change on human mobility. And what I want to talk through today is some of the moves and innovations we're starting to see, and a couple of the places where we have a combination of a lack of policy options and a lack of research. Yes, so I lead an initiative at MPI that has been producing some policy research, primarily global comparative research, on a set of themes and a set of policy areas where we see a lot of attention from primarily destination governments, and they are really interested in using the full suite of policy approaches that are needed to tackle climate change and migration. Now, if you take one thing away from my presentation, I hope it's this. It's that climate-related migration, yes, it's a massive challenge, but it's a massive challenge that we have policy tools to respond to, and a lot of the time we have the evidence that we need to make policy decisions. There are areas where that's not true, but for the bulk of our work it is. So we talk about a toolbox approach to climate mobility, and when it comes to managing the links between climate change and migration, it starts in people's places of origin, and it starts with the right to stay, and it starts with scaling up humanitarian and development assistance. So one of the ways that we've seen this nexus between some of the research that Alex has been doing and others have been doing and policy decisions is around where governments are choosing to make their climate resilience, their disaster risk reduction investments. So, for instance, the World Bank in West Africa has justified as part of one of their investments in flood-resilient infrastructure the fact that the modeling points out that this is going to be a place where people are moving out of. It's going to be a hotspot of climate out migration. That doesn't mean that we have a lot of this type of humanitarian and development assistance yet. There are an increasing number of donor governments stepping up to try and put money into these hotspots. But it is one of many priorities. Now, once people are moving, that's when our traditional asylum, border management, humanitarian protection, international protection systems kick in. There is no such thing as a climate refugee, and it does not have a normative or a legal basis, and is not going to in the next few years. So one of the things that we've done over the past year is had a lot of conversations with the policymakers who are in a space of political constraint when it comes to the international refugee system right now. There isn't a lot of public appetite to support the international refugee system, to support access to asylum for refugees. And in this current moment, that means that there is no appetite for expanding international law or expanding other systems to help people cross borders in the context of, to help people cross borders as refugees because they are moving because of climate change. Now, that doesn't mean people aren't coming, and it doesn't mean that policymakers aren't figuring out ways to respond to this. So in the US, we have some initial evidence, and I'm excited about what Alex finds in his next research, but we have some evidence that rainfall and precipitation variability in Central America is linked to arrivals at the US southern border. And in cases like this, you can't come in and claim asylum because you're moving because of a hurricane. But what we actually see happening is a lot of these people end up claiming asylum and getting asylum because they moved because of a hurricane and then were subject to gang violence and then were subject to persecution. And there's an increasing number of European governments who are interested in this more nuanced approach to creating options for people who arrive at borders who did move because of climate change or in part because of climate change. But because climate change is usually, as Sarah talked about, one of many reasons why people move, they are looking at ways that you could still give them access to protection. It is only in very rare cases, like the Tuvalu Australia agreement that was mentioned on the last panel, where you need climate-specific migration pathways. Instead, what MPI has been talking about is the need to create options for people to move in safe, legal, regular, humane ways that aren't refugee systems. So we can get a lot of people moving from the Pacific Islands. We can get a lot of people moving from Central America through labor pathways, through family reunification pathways. We don't need refugee pathways. And so we've been trying to push for a more, to sort of look at that part of the toolbox. And then finally, once people have arrived, they need all of the classic integration, social assistance work. So they need jobs, they need to get their kids into education, they need health services. And that all continues. So I went through a lot of the sort of existing policy attention. The basic part of the slide is governments are thinking about it. They are interested in ways that they can use their existing policy infrastructure to respond to increasing numbers of people moving because of climate change. But there are a few places where there's a combination of a lack of policy attention and a lack of evidence. One of them is around internal displacement and internal movements. So we know, we have a lot of data on large-scale internal movements. This is from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. They track disaster displacement year on year. In 2023, the number was 26 million? 20-something million, 26 million disaster displacements within countries in 2023. Now, the problem is that we are pretty sure most of these we know that most of these disaster displacements are temporary. So there were 26 million displacements in 2023, and 7.7 million people were still displaced by disasters. So that tells us that a lot of people are going home. What we don't know is which populations are most likely to go home and what enables them to be able to go home. And I think that means that there is a gap around some of the longitudinal data and some of the data around when does internal displacement become cross-border displacement. So this is one area where policymakers are looking at. A second is, we talk a lot about how climate change forces people to move, and we talk less about how climate change impacts people who've already moved. So this is a very, very rough map that we pulled together. But if you just overlay the climate vulnerability of countries, so this is ND gain data, and the darker red is more climate vulnerable, and the larger the gray circle, the larger the number of refugees. We have countries like Kenya, Uganda, that's Pakistan over in the top right, where these are incredibly climate vulnerable countries which host huge numbers of refugees. And we are seeing more and more cases of refugees who live in refugee settlements in really drought-stricken areas or really cyclone-stricken areas being forced to move again and again because of climate shocks. And this is an area that we don't talk about a lot, but I think is an important one. Last piece. I'm going to try wrap up so we can get to questions. Last piece. Fundamentally, we do need more data and more modeling on cross-border movements because of climate change and movements especially to the global north. This is just, it is a tough thing to say, but we have a lot of good data on internal climate migration and really limited evidence on what and who's moving across borders. This is because migration data is pretty bad in general, but there is no way for us to get the policy attention that we need without that sort of evidence. So at MPI, we've been working quite extensively with the current US administration, who has been really trying to push this agenda forward and really trying to set up programs and new policies around climate and migration. And they are faced with a real lack of evidence on who's moving to the United States because of climate change. And so I guess my final call for the academics in the room is to help us fill that gap, because we need it in order to move the policy agenda forward. I think that's, I'll stop there because I want to get to questions. So.
We do have 4 or 5 minutes, please. I know there's a lot of climate change and mobility issues. Please come up to the mic and ask a question. Come on up or raise your hand. There might one there and one there, so don't be shy.
Testing? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for an amazing panel. I'm curious, we saw with the Marshall Islands that very similar, almost nobody left because of climate change. But when we went to Springdale and spoke to the Marshallese, you ask them if they're planning on going back. 75 to 80% say no. Why? Climate change. Almost universal. So the question is, did they learn about climate change in the US? No, they didn't. They knew about it beforehand. And I'm wondering about the people who don't intend to come. Often they come because of healthcare, jobs, family. And they find that they can have their community in Springdale. This is a hypothesis. I'm wondering if people have seen this elsewhere, where climate change may not be the driving force for people to migrate, but it's the reason they don't return.
Would like to take that on.
I can speak a little bit to that. So there was actually just recently another proceedings of the National Academy of Science article by a colleague, Feliz Garipe at Princeton, and some other colleagues there. And they actually asked this precise question of whether people are likely to return to Mexico. In this case, they had data on migrants leaving areas that were drought-stricken in Mexico, and they also somehow had data on return migration, and what they found was return migration to areas that were drought-stricken. I'm not sure they actually interviewed people in the US from Mexico who were migrants to say, are you going back? But they had enough data from these longitudinal surveys and migration surveys that have been carried out to basically show that there is a decline in return migration. The only other place I've seen that kind of work on return migration is in Thailand, another long-term study by colleagues at University of North Carolina. And so, yes, climate factors do indeed influence the decision as to whether to return to a place that is perceived as climate vulnerable.
So we have 2 more questions. Would you each ask your question quickly, and those will be the last 2. Go ahead.
So my question, Lawrence's presentation brought this up. Would overseas territories of the Americas, French Polynesia, would those be considered internal migration, or would that be an example of, moving from, third world to global north?
And my question is particularly about the reason being why you chose those particular Caribbean countries for your research, and are you looking into other Caribbean countries? I'm particularly focusing on the U.S. Virgin Islands particularly, so.
All right.
Why
don't you start,
do-
Lawrence, and then
yeah.
Sarah?
On overseas territories, legally these are internal movements. It's similar to the Compacts of Free Association and RMI and others. They are, you have the legal right to move within the country. So it is, for these purposes, for a migration policy perspective, it is a internal movement. From a economics, from a social, from a sort of climate impacts perspective, it's very different. But the COFA example is really interesting. So there's a lot of research now on the Compacts of Free Association, which allow 3 islands to move and settle in the US at will and to return whenever they can. The interesting thing about Marshall Islands is the government there is very cognizant about this issue and has been trying to figure out ways to attract their people to return, because if they don't return, they don't pay taxes and they don't contribute to society. And so there are active efforts from these overseas territories to try and to tackle the problem of people leaving and not returning because of climate change.
Sarah?
Yeah, no, I was thinking it would be interesting to actually see if there's going to be an impact on remittances at some point, because I think so far we look at remittances more as kind of, and usually they do go to areas that are affected by disasters and where there is a kind of immediate financial need. But I wonder if in the long run there could be more of a, I think you mentioned the redlining effect, so more of a kind of deterrence effect, right, where people are like, why would I still put money there? Why did we choose those countries? We start usually with engagement at the regional level, and this was a regional effort anchored in the Association of Caribbean States, which covers all the countries around the Caribbean Sea basin, but it's independent countries, so we didn't include any US affiliated territories because the US is not part of the ACS. But we do work in a second phase of our engagement with national governments, and those are not necessarily the countries where we did the original research. So we will be working with individual countries and looking at their situation, and they can be different from the ones that we have looked at so far.
With that, I thank our panelists, and first a round of applause.